The morning I found out, I was looking for my father's watch. It was a Tuesday in late October, one of those gray days where the sky sits low and heavy like it's thinking about raining but can't quite commit. I'd been invited to my company's annual awards dinner that Friday, and I wanted to wear the watch. It was the only thing I had left of him, a 1968 Omega Seamaster, silver with a cream dial and a crack in the crystal that he'd never bothered to fix. He said the crack gave it character. He wore it every day for 32 years, and when he died of a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in March, it came off his wrist and went into my hands, and I'd kept it in the same mahogany box he'd kept it in, on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, behind a stack of winter sweaters. I climbed up on the step stool and moved the sweaters aside, and the box was gone. I stood there for a second with my hand pressed flat against the shelf, like maybe it was hiding behind my palm. I checked behind the box of old tax returns. I checked the shelf below. I got down and checked the dresser, the nightstand, the bathroom cabinet, even the kitchen counter, because sometimes I move things without thinking. I went through the apartment twice, then a third time, slower, more methodical, opening every drawer, checking every cabinet. Nothing. I sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to think clearly. Emma had been in the apartment on Sunday. She had her own key, we'd been together for 2 years, living in a shared rhythm between her place and mine, and she spent most weekends at my apartment. On Sunday she'd come over while I was at the gym, said she needed to grab a sweater she'd left, and I'd told her that was fine and thought nothing of it. She'd texted me she was heading out before I even got back. I hadn't thought about it once between Sunday morning and right now, standing in my bedroom with my hands shaking and a cold, creeping feeling spreading from my chest outward. I called her. She answered on the third ring, her voice easy and warm, the voice I'd heard say good morning 10,000 times. "Hey, you. What's up? Emma." I kept my voice flat because if I let anything into it right now, I was going to say something I couldn't take back. "Where's my father's watch?" A beat of silence. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. But it was the wrong kind of silence, not the silence of confusion but the silence of calculation. "What do you mean?" she said. "I mean it's gone. It was in the box on the shelf in my closet. I went to get it and it's not there. You were the last person in my apartment. So I'm asking you, where is it?" "Stephen, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't touch your closet." "You didn't touch my closet." "No. Emma." I pressed 2 fingers against my forehead. "Don't do this. Don't make me pull it apart piece by piece. Just tell me where it is." Another silence. Longer this time. "I needed the money," she said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What replaced it was something flat and resigned, like a confession that had been waiting behind a door and she'd finally stopped holding it shut. "I'm sorry. I was going to tell you. I needed it fast and I didn't know how to ask." The room tilted slightly. I put my hand on the nightstand. "You sold it. I'm so sorry. You sold my father's watch." "Stephen, that was the only thing I had left of him." My voice cracked on the last word and I hated it. I pressed my lips together and breathed through my nose. "It wasn't yours to sell. It was never yours. You knew what it meant to me. I told you the story about it. I told you he was wearing it when he died. You held that box and you read the inscription on the back and you asked me what it said, and I told you it said for David, who makes time worth keeping, and you said that was the most beautiful thing you'd ever heard." My hands were shaking badly now. "And you sold it." "I needed the money for Tyler's bail." I heard the words but they didn't land right. I turned them over. "Tyler," I said. "Your ex-boyfriend Tyler. He got arrested last week. DUI, his second one. He called me and he didn't have anyone else." "Stop." I stood up from the bed. "Stop talking. I need you to tell me where you sold it." "Stephen, please just let me explain, where did you sell it, Emma?" She gave me the name of a pawn shop on Morrison Street. She was still talking when I ended the call. I grabbed my jacket and my keys, and I left. The pawn shop was called Henderson's. It had a yellow sign with one burned-out bulb and a window full of guitars, power tools, and jewelry under glass. A bell jangled when I pushed the door open. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, mid-50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his head. I described the watch. 1968 Omega Seamaster, silver case, cream dial, cracked crystal, engraved on the back. He looked at me for a moment, then pulled a tray from under the counter. There it was. In a plastic bag with a price tag attached. $350. I felt something move through me that I couldn't name. Part grief, part fury, part something that had no word attached to it. That watch was stolen from me, I said quietly. The woman who brought it in did not have the right to sell it. It belongs to me. The man was careful. He'd been through situations like this before, I could tell. He asked for identification, asked if I could prove ownership. I had photos. I'd photographed the watch twice over the years for insurance documentation, and I had the photos on my phone, time-stamped, showing the serial number on the case back, showing the engraving. He looked at them. He looked at me. He told me he couldn't just hand it over, that he'd need to hold it pending verification, that if my claim checked out he'd need to cooperate with law enforcement. I told him I understood. I thanked him for not putting it in the window yet. I walked outside, stood on the sidewalk in the gray October air, and I called the police. I filed a theft report. The officer I spoke with was thorough and professional. I explained that my girlfriend had entered my home with a key I had given her in the context of our relationship, that she had removed property belonging to me without my knowledge or permission, and that she had sold it. I gave them the pawn shop address. I gave them Emma's full name, Emma Calloway, her address, her phone number. I told them about the watch, its value, its documentation. I told them it had belonged to my late father. The officer told me they'd follow up. I thanked him, hung up, and stood there for another minute on that sidewalk before I got in my car. I drove home. I sat in my parking spot with the engine off for a long time. Then I called her back. She answered immediately this time. She'd been waiting. I found it, I said. At Henderson's Pawn on Morrison. $350, Emma. That's what you sold my father's memory for. Stephen, I swear to God, I'm going to get it back. I'll pay them back and get it. I already reported it to the police as stolen. Because that's what it is. It's stolen property. The line went very quiet. You called the police on me. I reported the theft of my property. You happen to be the person who stole it. Stephen. Her voice shifted from stunned to something harder. He had nowhere else to turn. You don't understand what Tyler's been through. I don't care what Tyler's been through. I was amazed at how steady my voice was. Tyler is your ex-boyfriend. You are not his keeper. And even if you wanted to help him, you don't take the one irreplaceable thing a man owns and sell it for bail money for someone you used to sleep with. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. It wasn't like that. What was it like, then? She said nothing. Because here's what I know, I continued. I know you let yourself into my apartment while I was gone. I know you went through my closet. I know you found the watch in the box where I keep it, which means you knew exactly where it was, which means you've thought about this before. And I know you took it and sold it for $350 without asking me, without telling me, without giving me the chance to say no. So help me understand what I'm getting wrong. I panicked, she said finally. I didn't know what to do. I knew you'd say no if I asked. So you just took it. I was going to tell you. After Tyler was already out. After the watch was already gone. After I had no choice in the matter. I paused. You made sure there was nothing I could do. That's not panic, Emma. That's a plan. She started crying. I listened to it for about 5 seconds, and then I said, we're done. Don't come to the apartment. I'll have your things boxed up. Leave the key in the mailbox. Stephen, please, goodbye, Emma. I changed the locks the next morning. The days that followed had a strange, underwater quality. I went to work. I answered emails. I sat in meetings and contributed to conversations, and the whole time there was this low hum of disbelief running beneath everything, like a sound only I could hear. 2 years. 2 years of weekends and inside jokes and her handwriting on notes stuck to my refrigerator. 2 years of trusting someone with the shape of my life, and she had walked into my apartment and taken the one thing I'd told her mattered most. I didn't cry until Thursday. I was making dinner, just pasta, nothing complicated, and I reached up to the shelf where the mahogany box used to sit, just out of habit, just muscle memory, and my hand closed on empty air, and something in me came apart. I stood at the counter and held on to the edge of it and let it happen. 10 minutes, maybe. Then I splashed cold water on my face, finished the pasta, and sat down and ate it alone. My older brother Daniel called that night. We talked for an hour. He'd lost his watch too, not Dad's, but he understood what losing pieces of someone you loved felt like. He was furious on my behalf in the particular way that brothers can be furious, and it helped more than I expected. My best friend Greg came over on Friday with a 6-pack and no agenda other than sitting on my couch and being present, and that helped too. He didn't say much about Emma except that she'd shown him exactly who she was and I should take that seriously. She didn't make an impulsive mistake, he said, staring at the TV. She planned it. She waited until you were gone. She knew where the watch was. She knew what it was worth to you and she sold it anyway. That's not someone who lost their head. That's someone who decided you were less important than Tyler. I turned that over. It was exactly what I'd been thinking, but hearing it out loud made it settle in a way it hadn't before. I started looking into Tyler. Not obsessively, not vindicatively, I just needed to understand the shape of what had happened. His name was Tyler Breck. He and Emma had dated for about a year before we'd gotten together, and she'd told me they'd ended on bad terms, that he wasn't someone she was in contact with anymore. That had apparently been a comfortable lie she'd maintained for 2 years, because when I went back through what I knew, some comments she'd made, some evenings when she'd been vague about where she was, a few texts I'd glimpsed that she'd turned the phone away from, I started seeing a different picture assemble itself. She hadn't just helped him in a crisis. She'd been in contact with him. Maybe not constantly, maybe not in a way that crossed every line, but she'd kept that door open. And when he'd called from whatever holding cell with a bail number, she hadn't hesitated. She'd known exactly where to go and exactly what to take. I didn't sleep well that first week. But I got up every morning and I went to the gym, which I'd been neglecting, and I ran until my lungs burned and my legs were empty, and then I went to work, and I did my job well, and when I came home I sat in my apartment that had lost its comfortable routines, and I thought about what I was going to do next. The police called on Monday. A detective named Officer Carver followed up. He confirmed that they had contacted Emma and that she was cooperating, had acknowledged taking the watch, and that the pawn shop would be releasing it back to me. He explained that given the circumstances they were likely looking at a misdemeanor theft charge, that it would go to the DA, and that I might be contacted for a victim impact statement. I thanked him. He said he was sorry about the watch. It was my father's, I said. He wore it every day. I know, the detective said. You mentioned that in the report. I'm sorry for your loss. I picked up the watch from the evidence processing the following Wednesday. They'd photographed it, documented it, confirmed it against my records, and the pawn shop owner had been fully cooperative. When they placed it in my hands in its little evidence bag, I sat in my car for a long time before I drove home. I put it back in the mahogany box and I put the box on the shelf and I stood there with my hand on the closet door for a moment, just breathing. It was back. But it had been out in the world without me, and something about that wouldn't go away quickly. Emma's case moved forward slowly, the way these things do. But before it did, she made a series of decisions that might generously be called mistakes and more accurately be called self-destruction by installment. It started with texts. She sent me a long one the Wednesday after I'd broken up with her, explaining herself in exhaustive detail, Tyler's circumstances, their history, her panic, her intention to repay me. I read it once and didn't respond. She sent another one Thursday evening. Then another Friday morning. By Sunday she'd sent 11 messages, the tone shifting from apologetic to defensive to something that started to sound like she was rewriting history in real time, placing more and more responsibility on me for not being the kind of partner who makes it safe to ask for help. That last part genuinely surprised me. I'd read it twice to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. She was now, apparently, the victim of my emotional unavailability, which had forced her to steal from me. I forwarded several of these messages to my attorney, a sharp woman named Karen Hayward who I'd called the week before just to understand my options. Karen read them and said they'd be useful. Emma also called Greg. I didn't know this until Greg told me himself, slightly incredulous. She'd called him at some point Thursday evening and spent 40 minutes telling him that I was overreacting, that I didn't understand loyalty or compassion, that the watch was just an object. Greg, to his eternal credit, had listened politely, said, "I see," and then called me immediately afterward to report the entire conversation. She said it was just an object, I told Karen. They always do, Karen said. The next thing Emma did was show up at my building. Not at my apartment, I'd changed the locks and she no longer had a key, but in the lobby, buzzing my unit repeatedly on a Saturday afternoon when she apparently assumed I'd be home. I wasn't. My downstairs neighbor texted me that there was a woman buzzing my unit and crying in the lobby. I called the building manager and told him Emma was no longer permitted access. He handled it. She left eventually. The Saturday after that, she came back. This time I was home, and when my intercom buzzed and I heard her voice, I didn't answer. I called the non-emergency police line instead, explained that the person downstairs was the subject of an active theft case and had shown up at my building uninvited on multiple occasions. An officer came, spoke with her, and she left. She didn't come back after that. What she did instead was attempt a social media campaign that lasted approximately 4 days. She posted, without naming me but in terms that anyone who knew us could decode, a series of messages about being abandoned when I needed help most, and finding out who someone really is when you're vulnerable, and choosing compassion over things. The last one had a picture of hands cupped together, because subtlety had apparently left the building. A surprising number of people saw through it immediately. 2 of our mutual friends texted me privately to ask what had happened, and when I told them, briefly and factually, she took my father's watch, she sold it, I filed a police report. Both of them responded with variations of the same sentiment: "I'm so sorry, and I had no idea, and you absolutely did the right thing." I had a conversation with her cousin Diane, who I'd always liked, who called me directly and said she'd heard from Emma and she'd also heard from Emma's roommate Rachel, who had known more about the Tyler situation than Emma had probably intended, and that Diane was not calling to take sides but simply to tell me she was sorry this had happened to me and that she hoped I'd get the watch back. I told her I had it back. She seemed genuinely relieved. Emma's social media posts disappeared after about 4 days. No explanation, no follow-up. They just vanished, which made me think someone in her circle had suggested she stop. Meanwhile, I was still thinking about Tyler Breck. He'd gotten out on bail, Emma's theft had accomplished that much, and I found him without much difficulty. He wasn't hiding. He had a public social media presence, and within about 20 minutes of looking I'd established that he had a pattern of similar arrests going back 6 years, that he'd had a previous DUI in another state, that he currently worked as a contractor for a firm that held several commercial licenses that, depending on the state, could be affected by certain criminal records that he appeared to have disclosed incompletely or not at all. I sat with that information for a few days. Then I wrote a careful, factual email to the licensing board of the contracting association he worked under, noting his arrest record and its potential relevance to his professional standing. I included documentation, all publicly available. I copied his employer, whose name and contact information were listed on the company's public website. I didn't embellish. I didn't exaggerate. Everything I included was verifiable. I signed my name to it. If you're going to do something, do it so you can stand behind it in daylight. I sent it on a Thursday morning and went to work. The thing about revenge is that it only satisfies if it's proportional and justified, and if you're honest with yourself about what you're actually doing. I wasn't trying to ruin Tyler Breck's life out of spite. Tyler Breck had gotten himself arrested twice for driving drunk, which put other people's lives at risk, and his employer had a public safety responsibility they apparently didn't know they needed to take seriously. I was providing them information. What they did with it was up to them. What they did with it, as it turned out, was suspend Tyler's contracting work pending a review. I heard about this through the particular social media osmosis by which information travels in circles of people who know people, and I registered it with something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was close, a sense of things settling into their correct positions. Emma heard about it too. She sent me one final message, the most furious one yet, telling me I had destroyed Tyler's career because of my ego, that I was vindictive and cruel and that she felt sorry for whoever came after me. I read it, took a screenshot, sent it to Karen, and then blocked her number. Karen sent me a note 3 days later that the DA's office had received the case and was reviewing it for prosecution. I'd be contacted for a victim impact statement when the time came. What happened next I mostly learned about secondhand, through Greg and through Diane, who seemed to have taken up a kind of occasional informant role that I hadn't requested but didn't discourage. Tyler, whose bail had been secured with the money from my father's watch, violated a condition of that bail by leaving the state. I don't know where he went or why. Maybe he'd decided the contracting suspension and the pending case were too much, or maybe he'd always been someone who ran from things. Whatever the reason, leaving the state while on bail is not a small matter. A warrant was issued. The bail was forfeit, which meant the $350 Emma had sold my father's watch for, the money she had given to the bail bondsman as part of the process, was gone. Not to Tyler, not to Emma, just gone. Absorbed into the system because the person it was meant to secure had disappeared. When I heard that, I sat with it for a long moment. She had sold my father's watch. The men she'd sold it for had left. The money was forfeit. The charge against her was proceeding. And she had ended up, through the pure mathematics of her own choices, with absolutely nothing to show for any of it. No Tyler. No money. No watch to return. No relationship. Just a pending charge, a ruined reputation among people who knew us, and a series of deleted social media posts that several people had screenshot before they disappeared. I thought about what my father would have said about that. He'd been a practical man, not given to moralizing. He probably would have just looked at it and nodded slowly, the way he did when a situation demonstrated its own point. I missed him very badly right then. I picked up the mahogany box and held it in both hands for a minute. Then I set it back on the shelf. 6 months passed. Things moved. I focused on work, which had always been a reliable anchor when other things were turbulent. I'm in project management for a mid-sized construction firm, and a large hospital renovation contract had been stalled for months in permit and budget disputes. I'd been working on it quietly, building relationships with the city planning office, restructuring the budget proposal, and in February it finally cleared. My director, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, called me into her office and told me the client had specifically mentioned my name in their approval communication, and that she was promoting me to senior project director. I shook her hand and thanked her and went back to my desk and stared at my computer screen for a moment with something that I eventually identified as genuine happiness. I called Daniel that evening. He told me Dad would have been proud, and I believed him, and that landed somewhere warm and real. I'd been going to the gym consistently since October, which I hadn't been doing before. Emma and I had settled into a comfortable, slightly sedentary pattern of takeout and television on weeknights, and I'd let things slide. 5 months of consistent work had made a noticeable difference. I'd put on some muscle, lost a soft edge I'd gotten used to carrying, started sleeping better. A colleague named Pete told me I looked like I'd been on vacation for 6 months. I told him it was the gym. Whatever it is, he said, keep doing it. Greg noticed too. He came over for dinner in March and looked at me with something like relief. You look good, he said. I feel pretty good, I said. And it was true. Not in a performed way, not in a way I was narrating to myself to get through hard days. Just genuinely, quietly true. I started running on weekends. Not the punishing, burning lung runs of the early weeks, but long easy runs through the city park on Saturday mornings, the kind where your body finds its rhythm and your mind goes quiet. I'd put on my father's watch before I left sometimes, not on the runs themselves, but in the mornings when I sat with coffee and looked out the window. Just to feel it on my wrist. Just to remember that it was still there. The victim impact statement process came in late February. Karen walked me through it carefully. I wrote something honest and measured, not angry, not theatrical, just true. I wrote about who my father was. I wrote about the watch and what it meant to hold it when he died. I wrote about coming home and finding it missing. I wrote about the particular kind of loss that is not just the loss of an object but the loss of what the object holds, and how some things, once violated, cannot be fully restored even when the physical thing is returned. Karen said it was one of the best victim impact statements she'd read. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just said thank you. Emma pleaded guilty to misdemeanor theft. She received a suspended sentence, community service, and was ordered to pay restitution, $350, the sale price of the watch. The restitution amount struck me as almost absurd given the circumstances, but Karen explained that it was based on the transactional value of the theft, not the sentimental or historical value of the item. I donated the restitution money to a hospice foundation that had cared for my father in his last weeks. That felt right. Emma's name was on a court record now. It would follow her in background checks, in rental applications, in certain professional licensing contexts. I hadn't planned that outcome specifically. I'd reported the theft because it was theft, not as a calculated move, but it was an outcome, and I didn't feel guilty about it. She had made choices. Choices have consequences. That's not revenge, that's just the world working the way it's supposed to. I heard, through Diane, that Emma had lost her job, not directly because of the charge, but because she'd missed several days dealing with the legal process, had been distracted and difficult to work with in the months following, and had eventually been let go in a round of layoffs that she suspected, according to Diane, had been shaped partly by her declining performance. She'd had to move out of her apartment, which she couldn't afford on unemployment, and had gone to stay with her mother in New Jersey. I registered this information without pleasure. I didn't wish her to be homeless or broke. I just didn't feel responsible for it. She had made the choices that led to the consequences. The line from her choices to her outcomes was straight and clear and entirely of her own construction. I met someone in April. I want to be careful about how I say this because it matters to me that it's understood correctly. I wasn't looking. I hadn't been interested in dating since October and hadn't forced the issue. But April happened. Her name was Claire, and I met her at a fundraiser for the hospice foundation I'd donated to. She was on the events committee, had been volunteering with them for 2 years. We ended up at the same table, talking about nothing in particular, the food, the speaker, an absurd miscommunication about the seating arrangement that had the whole table laughing, and at the end of the evening she handed me a business card and said she'd enjoyed the conversation. I called her 2 days later. We got coffee. We talked for 3 hours, and when I walked back to my car I realized I hadn't thought about Emma once the entire evening. That felt like something. I told Claire about Emma on our third date. Not everything, not in exhaustive detail, but the shape of it, the watch, the theft, the police report, the case. I wanted her to know because I'd learned that keeping important things vague is its own kind of dishonesty, and because if she heard about it later without having heard it from me first, that would feel like a small betrayal, and I was done with those in every direction. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "The watch was your father's." "Yes." "And you have it back?" "Yes." "Good," she said, simply, and moved on to something else, and I felt a knot I hadn't known I was carrying loosen slightly in my chest. We took it slow. She was patient, which I needed, and I was honest, which she seemed to appreciate. There were no games, no ambiguity, no text messages that needed to be interpreted. She said what she meant and she meant what she said, and I found that I'd forgotten how clean that felt. By summer she'd met Greg and Daniel, and both of them liked her in that particular way where they told me separately without coordination, which I took as a meaningful sign. Greg pulled me aside at a birthday dinner in June and said, "She's the real thing, man. Don't overthink it." Daniel texted me later that week, "She's good people. Dad would have liked her." I read that on my phone while sitting at my desk, and I had to take a moment before I responded. 8 months after Emma had sold the watch, I ran into her. I wasn't expecting it. These things rarely come with warning. It was a Saturday in late June, warm and clear, the kind of Saturday that makes the whole city feel like it's participating in the same good mood. I was at the downtown farmers market with Claire. She had a thing for local honey and a specific jam vendor she was devoted to, and we were making our way through the crowded stalls when I looked up and saw Emma about 20 feet away. She was looking at a table of candles. She hadn't seen me yet. The first thing I noticed was that she looked tired. Not dramatically, not in a way a stranger would notice, but in a way I noticed because I'd once known the version of her that looked rested. Her posture was slightly diminished. Her clothes were fine but looked like she'd pulled them together without enthusiasm. She was alone. She turned and saw me at the same moment I was thinking I could probably move in the other direction and she'd never know. We looked at each other for 2 seconds across the crowd. Then she started walking toward me. I stayed where I was. Claire, to her credit, noticed the shift in my posture immediately. She had a quality of attentiveness that I'd come to rely on, and she looked at me and said quietly, "Someone you know?" "My ex," I said. "The one I told you about." She nodded and held her ground beside me. She didn't step back, didn't create distance. Just stood there. Emma stopped about 5 feet from us. Up close the tiredness was more apparent, there were shadows under her eyes that weren't makeup, and something in her face had changed in ways that were hard to name but easy to see. She looked at me, and then she looked at Claire, and something registered in her expression that she quickly smoothed over. "Stephen," she said. "Emma." A pause. She looked at her hands, which were holding a small paper bag from one of the market stalls. "You look really good," she said. Her voice was careful, controlled, but there was something underneath it. You look really good." "Thanks," I said. Another silence. Claire stood quietly beside me, not performing anything, just present. "I owe you an apology," Emma said. "A real one. Not the kind I kept sending in texts." She swallowed. "What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it. I told myself stories about it to make it feel less wrong, and none of those stories were true. I'm sorry." I looked at her for a moment. The apology was real, I could hear that it was. It wasn't the calculated apology of someone trying to get something back. It was the apology of someone who had lived with what they'd done long enough to see it clearly. "I appreciate that," I said. And I meant it. Not warmly, not in a way that opened any door, but honestly. She nodded. She glanced at Claire again, briefly, then back at me. "Is the watch okay?" she asked. They returned it. She closed her eyes for just a second. "Good," she said quietly. "I'm glad." There was another pause, and then she said, "I heard about Tyler. That he left." "I heard too." She looked down at her paper bag. "The money's gone. All of it." She said this without accusation, without asking for anything. Just stating a fact. I want you to know that I know that what I did was wrong on its own, independent of how it turned out. I don't want to be the kind of person who only recognizes a mistake when it costs them. I considered what to say to that. I thought about my father, who had been a fair man, not a hard one. I hope you figure out how to be that person, I said. I genuinely do. But I'm not the one who can help you with that. She nodded again, once, like that was the answer she'd expected and maybe the answer she deserved. Take care of yourself, Stephen, she said. You too, Emma. She turned and walked away through the crowd. I watched her for a moment, and then I didn't watch her anymore. Claire slipped her hand into mine. You okay? She asked. I thought about it honestly. Yeah, I said. I am. She squeezed my hand and said, jam. And we went to find the jam vendor. That fall, Patricia approved my proposal for a new project management system that I'd been building out over the summer. The hospital renovation wrapped on schedule and under budget, a combination that doesn't happen as often as it should, and at the year-end company dinner my team received a commendation from the client. I gave a short speech. Afterward, a senior partner named Robert shook my hand and said he'd been watching my work and he'd like to talk early in the new year about expanding my portfolio. We had that conversation in January. I won't go into all of it, but my role changed in ways I'd been working toward for 3 years and had started to believe might not happen on any timeline I cared about. They did happen. They happened because I'd done good work and kept doing it even when other parts of my life were difficult, maybe especially when other things were difficult, because the work had been one of the things I could control. Daniel called when I told him. He made a sound that is hard to transcribe but that I can only describe as pure older brother satisfaction. I took my father's watch to a jeweler in December. Not to sell it, not to change it, just to have it professionally cleaned and to have the crystal properly repaired. I'd thought about this for a while. My father had said the crack gave it character, and I'd kept that thought for a long time after he died, a way of preserving something of how he'd seen it. But I'd come to understand that preserving his view of it didn't mean I had to preserve it exactly as it was. He'd worn it and loved it and kept it imperfect because he was the kind of man who didn't worry about those things. I was a different kind of man, and I could make a different choice about the crack without losing what the watch meant. The jeweler's name was Frank, a small precise man who knew Omega movements the way some people know languages, fluently, with affection. He spent 5 minutes examining it and told me about its history, the specific production year, a detail about the movement I hadn't known. He treated it like the piece of history it was. I picked it up 2 weeks later with a new crystal, clean and clear. I put it on and looked at my wrist and thought about my father, who had worn the same watch to every important thing in his life, my parents' first date, my brother's birth, my birth, 32 years of ordinary days and particular ones. It had crossed his wrist for all of it. It was still crossing mine. A year and a half after the October morning when I'd reached up to that shelf and found the box missing, I put on the watch to wear to a dinner reservation I'd made at a place Claire had wanted to try for months. It was our 8-month anniversary of the conversation at the farmer's market when she'd said, casually, over too late at night delivery pasta, that she loved me and I'd said it back without hesitation, which was the right answer because it was also the true one. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and adjusted the strap. The watch sat on my wrist the way it always had, the way it had sat on my father's wrist, and the new crystal caught the bathroom light cleanly. Claire appeared in the doorway in a blue dress she'd been uncertain about. Too much, she asked. Not at all, I said. You look great. She looked at the watch. Your dad's. Yeah. She crossed the room and looked at it properly, the way she did with things she was genuinely curious about, fully, without performance. Tell me about him again, she said. She'd heard the broad strokes but she had the quality of genuinely wanting to know people, even people she could only access through the memories of others. So I told her about him. About the watch and where it came from. About the inscription, for David, who makes time worth keeping. About the crack he'd never fixed because he said it gave it character. About the heart attack on a Wednesday morning in March, and the way the watch had come off his wrist and into my hands, and what it had felt like to hold it. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without hurrying toward the end of what I was saying. When I finished she was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was a good man, she said. He was, I said. She took my hand and we went to dinner. I never heard from Emma again after the farmer's market. I heard through Diane, the last time Diane and I spoke, a brief exchange at a mutual friend's birthday party, that Emma had taken a job at a nonprofit in New Jersey, something in community services, and that she seemed to be doing better. Diane said this without editorializing, and I received it the same way. I hoped it was true. Not for my sake, not because I needed her to be okay in order to be okay myself, but just because it's better when people do better. The world works more cleanly when people learn from things. Tyler Breck, as far as I knew, was still wherever he'd gone when he'd skipped his bail. That warrant didn't expire. That was between him and the law, which is exactly where it should be. And me? I was at a restaurant with a woman I loved, wearing my father's watch, which had been to the jeweler and come back with a new crystal and was on my wrist where it belonged. I was a senior project director. I had a brother who called every Sunday and a best friend who came over for dinner twice a month and a father whose watch still crossed my wrist every time something mattered. The waiter came. We ordered. Claire told me about a project she was organizing for the foundation, something ambitious and complicated that she was excited about and a little daunted by, and I listened and thought about how to help her structure it, and we talked about it over pasta and a decent bottle of red wine, and outside the restaurant windows the city was bright and moving. At some point she refilled my glass and caught me looking at her and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "Just thinking I'm pretty lucky." She shook her head like I was being embarrassing, but she was smiling. I looked down at my wrist. At the Omega Seamaster, silver, cream dial, crystal clean and uncracked. At the watch that had belonged to my father, who had taught me, without ever stating it directly, that what you do when someone treats you badly says more about you than it does about them. That you take care of your things. That you don't let what people do to you define what you do next. That you move forward, and you build things, and you show up for the people who deserve it. I turned my wrist slightly and the watch caught the light. Time kept moving. That's what it does. And I was keeping up with it.